All right, welcome everybody to this week's edition of Crop Hour. My name is Amanda Bachmann. I'm the SDSU Extension Urban Entomology Field Specialist based in Pierre, South Dakota. I'm here with Dr. Rhoda Burrows, who is one of our Extension Horticulture professors based in Rapid City. And we are kicking off Specialty Crop Week here on Crop Hour. If you have questions for either of us, throw those in the Q&A and we'll handle those at the end of each segment. So Dr. Burrows will be presenting first, and then we'll do some questions, and then I'll go ahead and give my presentation, and we'll do some more questions. If you're having technical difficulties at any time, feel free to throw something in the chat to the host and panelists, and we'll take a look there. Questions, though, throw those in the Q&A. That makes it easier for us to find them. At the very, very end, for those of you watching live, if you are a certified crop advisor, there will be a QR code for you to get credits for the live presentation. And if you've got somebody who you're like, man, they should have been here, there will be a recording posted later on the YouTube channel. No credits for that, but you can still catch our information later. So I think that's all I have for housekeeping. Rhoda, if you're ready to go, I will turn it over to you and I'll keep an eye on the Q&A.
Good morning, everyone. As we get started here, I'm Rhoda Burrows. I'm a horticulture extension specialist at SDSU. I'm based here in Rapid City, and I cover the whole state working with fruit and vegetable growers and food safety, which is what I'm going to be talking about this morning. So today I'm going to cover the period after you take the crop out of the field and how you handle it before it goes to the consumer. That's a particularly vulnerable time for food safety issues, uh, particularly for cross-contamination. And I wanted to start this morning just by talking about a couple outbreaks of cantaloupe. This was a while back, but provides some important learning lessons. Um, you may remember cantaloupe from Colorado that had an outbreak of listeria that hospitalized 143 people and caused 33 deaths. And then shortly after that was an outbreak of salmonella that hospitalized 94 people and caused 3 deaths. And has the FDA investigated how did that happen? We came away with some important lessons. And I refer to it as a packing house, which you may have, or you may just have a table out in your yard, maybe with a roof over it. So, but many of the same principles apply regardless. Uh, One of the main issues, and that's something always to be concerned about, is water pooling. Anytime there's warm, moist water, we can have a proliferation of bacteria. Um, in the packing house with listeria, listeria was found in the water that was pooled underneath the packing line. They also found that you couldn't uh, access the trench line drain for cleaning very well, possibly why the water was pooling, and the floor was difficult to clean. More concerning, perhaps, was that there was accumulated organic matter on multiple areas of the conveyor, including rollers and belts. And salmonella was found on the pack line itself, and I believe listeria was too in that case. So one thing to really watch out for is any accumulation of organic matter in any of the crevices of equipment or cables that you're working with. So be very careful about that, because that's where uh, bacteria can hide. And finally, no sanitizer was used on the equipment. They were cleaning it, but they were not sanitizing it, which is one of the basic practices that should be done anytime you've got a food surface, and anytime produce is taken from the field, it is now food and should be treated the same as you would in a kitchen. So no sanitizer was used on the equipment. Um, no sanitizer was used in the spray wash water, which is an option. It doesn't have to be used, but if you're using a dump tank or bin where you've got water and you're dunking the produce in it, you really need to have sanitizer there. Sanitizer doesn't sanitize individual produce pieces, but what it does is prevent the movement of bacteria from one infected piece of produce to everything else. Some more problems they found with these two packing houses. They weren't pre-cooling the cantaloupes before storing and shipping, and cantaloupes can hold a lot of field heat, so they were packed while they were still moist from the packing line, and uh, were still warm. So warm, wet conditions, again, that's the that's what you really have to watch for with allowing harmful bacteria to grow. Uh, and if we look at a cantaloupe close up here, you can see the netted surface provides a lot of hiding places for moisture to accumulate and bacteria. So cantaloupe are really a high risk crop. They weren't adequately monitoring or controlling wash water disinfectant levels in either case. And so again, just using sanitizer isn't any good if you're not uh, monitoring it. Um, and you can get test strips to make sure that you've got the correct levels. They were also failing to empty garbage receptacles, and so you could have flies coming from call fruit or worse, uh, and flies going directly to the produce. Then you could also be attracting mice and rats and whatnot that could be carrying uh, bacteria around uh, on their feet, for example. So produce standards that have been developed by the FDA and GAPS as well uh, are going to focus on routes of microbial contamination that have been identified in these various food safety outbreaks. So we're looking at everything from domesticated and wild animals in the field, uh, manures that might be applied, and then advancing into the packing area, all the equipment and tools and building, uh, including worker health and hygiene. Uh, so, so looking at how we can address those individual issues to keep things more sanitary. Uh, so these are some post-harvest practices, and fortunately for us, the post-harvest practices that reduce microbial risk will also reduce product loss to spoilage or shrinkage. They're going to keep out plant pathogens that can attack post-harvest as well. And we're talking about everything from cleaning the product if that's going to take place, sorting out culls, bruised or damaged produce from the good produce, and then getting it cooled down uh, if you have the capacity to do that. And then once you've gone through that, then uh, where you're storing it, how you're packaging it, and how you get it to market. One thing I want to note about cuts and bruises, uh, we take those very seriously because if something is bruised, you have cells that have split open and are going to leak their contents, and those nutrients can feed pathogens, not just pathogens, plant pathogens that can destroy the produce, but also human pathogens. So those are very concerning, and we want to call those out. Plant pathogens themselves can have the same effect where they're degrading cells and providing foods for other pathogens. And fungal infections, in particular, can increase the pH of the contents and make the fruit more suitable for salmonella and E. coli. So they can increase the risk in that way. So looking at the big picture, it's all about keeping things clean. And you want to consider anything that will touch the produce or is right in the near vicinity. So you can see on this list, we try to consider anything that is potentially contacting the produce, starting with a harvest knife, um, the hands and clothing of the people that are handling that produce, the harvest containers, uh, any post-harvest water that you might be using uh, to clean the produce or to clean equipment should all be potable water. Uh, Containers that you're packing the produce into, and then of course the larger picture of the building, the packing area, and the transport vehicles. We have here some produce ready to go to market, and this is not concerning to have this open for the pumpkins there, uh, but that appears to be watermelon, and if that's the case, that really should be covered, uh, both to keep it from sun damage, but also to keep it from dirt and dust that can get in uh, and may contaminate the watermelon. So a little bit about harvest containers. At the start of the harvest season, you want to wash and sanitize all harvest containers. And then prior to each field harvest day, you want to, before you go out in the field, you want to inspect all your containers, make sure they've been cleaned and sanitized. And if they're not, stop and do that. How do you do that? Remove any dirt or debris, brush it out, whatever your practice is, and then wash and sanitize the containers. Especially look for any that had leftover produce, any kind of organic matter that's remaining, and of course, if you see signs of rodents, mouse turds or whatever it might be. Hopefully not whole mice. So cleaning and sanitizing, I've been talking about, remember you can't sanitize a dirty surface. If you would try, you would be sanitizing the surface of the dirt, but not actually the surface of the container itself. And uh, just sanitizing the surface of the dirt does not control any bacteria that may be hiding underneath it. So first of all, you have to physically remove the dirt from the surfaces. Um, and you can use that with clean water and detergent. Um, and what do you use for detergent? It must be labeled for food contact surfaces. So look for that on the label. Uh, Chlorine is often used, bleach, um, but be careful with bleach that it actually says on the label of that individual uh, container of bleach that it actually says for food contact surfaces. Not all of them do. If you're actually using it has a sanitizer in water that's going to contact the produce directly, like you're dunking it in to clean, then it actually has to say for use with vegetables or produce. Um, so there's a little difference in the label there. Just be sure that that it's labeled. Um, there are other options other than bleach, of course. Some places use ozone, perioxyacetic acid, PAA, uh, hydrogen peroxide, and some of those are labeled uh, for organic certification. So uh, Tsunami Spectrum Sanidate is one that I've found here in Rapid City I can get a hold of. It is quite a bit more expensive than bleach, but a little goes a long way. So, um, and again, must be labeled for use with produce. Remember, anything that water post-harvest that touches produce must be potable water or uh, either urban or rural water systems, or if it's well water, it's been tested to make sure that it has no E. coli. Again, follow the label directions for any sanitizers. Some of them you wash off, some of them you let dry. Uh, and you can get test kits, little strip tests that you can dunk into your solution and make sure the concentration is what's provided on the label. And different produce has different levels of sanitizer, so be aware of that. Bleach solution in particular must be made fresh each time. Again, the label will provide that information. But bleach after a day or two, once it's diluted, loses its ability to uh, be a sanitizer. So make it up every day. If possible, I recommend using a spray over system rather than a dump tank, just because you're decreasing the possible cross contamination, not eliminating it if the table gets wet and it's not being cleaned. You could obviously get cross contamination that way. Worker health and hygiene, train all your workers, including any volunteers, whatever the age may be. Uh, what do you train them in? Proper hand washing. Make sure that they never handle, and you never handle produce with unwashed hands, just like you should be doing in your kitchen. Uh, Making sure that if you're in clean clothes, maybe you use a clean apron that gets washed. Uh, And of course, if you're not feeling well, don't handle produce. That can contaminate the produce. We've had outbreaks with hepatitis and norovirus from handlers that were sick. And use gloves if you have cuts or sores on your hands. And I often uh, manage to cut myself. Uh, Sort of uh, if there's a way to poke or puncture myself, I find it. So I use gloves, uh, but it should be either single-use gloves or gloves that you can sanitize. As you can see here, this guy's handling it with sort of a cloth leather glove, and this is fresh lettuce that people are going to eat. Uh, this is a very bad practice. uh, uh, You'd get a bad mark if I caught you doing that, because those gloves cannot be sanitized. As far as packing the produce, you want only new single-use containers or clean reusable containers. Remember to store any packing containers and materials where they can't get contaminated from mice or birds, etc. You want to inspect if you have cold storage areas, make sure that you're keeping those coolers clean. And that's sometimes hard to do during the middle of the harvest season, but that should be a priority for you. And one thing to be careful about is make sure that there's no condensation or dripping on produce. Uh, So be aware of that. And remember, cooling is not required, but if used, do it properly. And then finally, your cleaning and transport. Uh, you want to, I recommend avoiding washing produce for direct market sales unless it's, visibly dirty and you really do need to take some of that dirt off. Sometimes you can use a soft brush to do that without water. It decreases uh, the risk of contamination. Um, and anytime you wash produce, you're increasing contamination risk, cross contamination, and again, creating that warm, wet environment or that cool, wet environment, which is what Listeria likes. Uh, and that you're removing some of the protection uh, that the individual produce has, which can decrease shelf life. So if you can avoid it, great. Uh, then when you're transporting, whether it's to farmer's market or to a restaurant or wherever it might be, again, don't allow the produce to contact unclean surfaces during transport. Maybe you're growing melons and you take them and sit by the roadside and sell them directly. Make sure that you're covering uh, the back of your pickup with a tarp. Um, that can also help avoid bruising. Uh, you don't want to put them in just an uncleaned pickup where you've got dogs or dirty boots or whatever it might have been in the back. Uh, and then remember to keep the produce cool and out of direct sun during transport as much as feasible. One last point, and this is traceability, and the FDA has been uh, really focusing on this as a way to make it easier and quicker to avoid, to identify food safety outbreaks and back to where it originated so that they can do more efficient recalls. And this will help you too. Uh, for larger producers, and this is a good idea actually for everyone. Uh, on each container of food, like a bin or a box, you want to have the information of where that individual produce came from, which field, what day it was picked, and who was working that day. And that will make it much easier in case there's a possibility of somebody getting sick from your produce. Uh, you can, if it's from a different field or something, you can uh, maybe not recall uh, that particular produce, unless of course it came from your warehouse. But um, and then who you sold it to. So we've done one step back. Uh, and then one step forward, who you sold the produce to and the delivery date. And one step back, I should also include field practices. So if you got manure from somebody, for example, you want to have that information too. You can use a QR code. It's not required, uh, but it can be a great tool for advertising because you can put information on that will direct consumers to your website, uh, and you can have pictures of your farm or the field that the vegetable was grown in, or recipes, even a feedback form. So that's a good option. And with that, I will stop and take any questions. Here's my contact information. My cell phone number, uh, it's probably easier to reach me than my office number. But if you're trying to get a hold of me, probably the best way is my email in case I'm out and about.
All right, thank you, Rhoda. It doesn't look like we have any questions in the Q&A right now.
All right.
Um, so, but if folks think of any during my presentation, go ahead and put them into the Q&A. And also for folks, if you're interested in more of the specialty crop information or some of the home horticulture stuff, we'll put in our shameless plug here for our garden and yard newsletter during the season, and also for our program Garden Hour, which airs in the evenings. We're having two of our off-season ones, one in February next week on the 11th, and then one in April. I believe it's April 1st. And then we'll be picking up our regular season on the beginning of May. So you can catch Rhoda and I there as well. So we've got lots of places to find us on the horticulture side of things, and we're really grateful to the agronomy team for making some room for us here in the crop hour schedule, because I know we've got a lot of specialty crop producers in the state. And also, Rhoda, you and I are both going to be at Upper Midwest Urban Rural Ag this week, correct?
Yes. And I'll be
Yes.
talking more about food safety or have some handouts if you just want to have some basic information.
Yeah, and I'll be there with the SARE booth, the Sustainable Ag Research and Education. So if you need any SARE resources or want to talk about grant funding opportunities, I'll be there as well. So yeah, we'll be in Chamberlain on Thursday and Friday. So if you are a specialty crop producer or just somebody who's interested in some of the urban ag issues, you can definitely come check us out there as well. And looks like we've got some great links in the chat. So if you need some of those resources, like the newsletter or garden hour, you can find those links in the chat. And with that, I'll go ahead and do my share screen, and then we'll be back with more questions at the end. All right, perfect. So yeah, hi everyone. I work in the urban entomology world now. I no longer have to worry about pesticide education, so some of you might recognize me from that, but that is not my job anymore. I am now 100% cool bug stuff, and I'm here to talk about insect management strategies in vegetable production. So I come from a diversified vegetable production background. I did my PhD at Penn State, and I worked in a diversified vegetable system there. I did work in snap beans, I did work with sweet corn, I dabbled in some soybean stuff. But one of the cool things about Pennsylvania agriculture is that we could grow pretty much anything except for citrus. So the ag landscape out there was very different than what we have here in South Dakota. But in South Dakota, we are ramping up our specialty crop and our vegetable production. So the challenges in a diversified system like that is that you have a lot of crops, which means that you can have a lot of pest pressure from all sorts of different things, insects, diseases. I'm going to focus on the insect side of things, but the principles that I'm going to be talking about also, cover your weeds, your diseases, anything that falls under that pest umbrella. And in, diversified vegetable production, you have a low tolerance for damage. So like Rhoda was talking about like the cantaloupes, nobody's going to be, wanting to buy a cantaloupe that has like a soft, weird spot or a blemish on it. So we can, we want to make sure that our produce is looking, sort of perfect for the consumer. And then we also have short pre-harvest intervals. So the time when the produce is ripe and to get it sold before it spoils, it's not a lot of time. So for some of our strategies, like if you think about some of the chemical inputs, they have a pre-harvest interval on there, time in which you have to wait from application to harvest. And so that can be a challenge for, managing problems and then getting the crop out of the field in time for it to still be marketable. So, how are we going to handle these very diverse and complicated challenges? This presentation is a stealth introduction to integrated pest management. So integrated pest management, or IPM, is a sustainable approach that combines the use of prevention, avoidance, monitoring, and suppression strategies in a way that minimize economic health and environmental risks. And this is something, this is a big concept. Probably each of the slides in here I could do, their own sort of like 20-minute talk on. So I'm going to try to, keep it to the summary. But the IPM approach is, really a synthesis of a whole bunch of tools. So we're going to be talking about all of these things in the bullet point here. But the big picture is that you're using your knowledge and your skills to come up with a plan to both monitor for pests, identify them, and then also manage them and manage them in a way that you're thinking about future seasons. So we're not just sort of doing the acute treatments, dealing with sort of the immediate acute problems, but we are looking at maybe some of the chronic issues and thinking about how we can, change our production strategies so that we can handle things before they happen. Also, and this is a circle. Like there's no real end to integrated pest management. It's a framework that you're following throughout the season and from season to season. So right now, if you don't have a notebook or some way that you're keeping records about your production, 2025 is a great year to start. We'll be talking about record keeping and some of the notes that you can keep on your crops to help you out in the future. So we're going to go through all of these, and I'm going to take a drink real quick. All right. So pest identification is super critical. I'm an entomologist, so I handle, the things with 6 legs, sometimes the things with 8 legs, but having a body and knowing what you have is a, like, critical first step for, knowing what you need to do. So whenever possible, you wanna capture or record the critter. I have pictured here some grasshoppers that are in a zip top plastic bag. So using containers to just like scoop up an insect. If you've got nets, like a sweep net or even, a butterfly net, those aren't quite as sturdy. But if you're doing sweeps of your fields, you can kind of dump those contents into a zip top bag and then see what you've got. You can throw it in the freezer to sort of check it out later. Super useful technique. You may want to be using traps. There are some insects that we have really great pheromone lures for. I know for folks who are growing cucurbits, the squash vine borer is a big problem, and there are pheromone lure traps that you can use for monitoring that pest. Also, taking a good picture, making sure that you're close, in focus, super handy. And then, doing your visual inspection and writing down notes. Like maybe you accidentally leave your phone behind and you do, kind of a quick sketch to look up some stuff later. But identification is really important. I really sort of encourage everyone, like, don't treat unless you have a diagnosed issue, especially when I'm dealing with folks with home garden or insects inside the home. I get a lot of folks who will spray first and then ask questions later, and it's really critical so that you're saving yourself time and money, and also sort of reducing some of those inputs to identify first and then move on to treatment. But yeah, identify that body. Images, samples. There's lots of identification resources out there, and I've got a list in a few slides. But you also have access to SDSU Extension. We've got identification resources here. Me for entomology. We've got Patrick Wagner out in Rapid City as well. And then we've got our plant diagnostic clinic. So if you think you have a disease issue, we've got you covered there as well. Um, like I said earlier, pest is a big umbrella term. I'm focusing on insects, but there are weeds, there are pathogens. You could also have abiotic damage to your plant. It could be a nutrient deficiency. Um, I get a fair number of folks who see an insect on a plant and they're like, "Yep, this is what's killing, my tree or my shrub or, my lettuce plant or whatever." And sometimes, like in the case of this picture, it's just a moth that's like hanging out, having a good day. So just because you see an insect somewhere, doesn't mean that it's the one causing damage. I am a little bit of, an insect evangelist or apologist. It's not always the insect's fault, but sometimes it is. So, don't jump to conclusions in your IPM process here. Like work the system, start with identification, and then we'll get you some solutions from there. And identification allows you to better manage your problem, or even, that you don't need to manage it. Um, Identifying the life stage of the organism can also be really important. If you think about butterflies, so our insects in the order Lepidoptera, their larvae are caterpillars. So you think about, kids' book, Hungry Hungry Caterpillar, those things are eating a lot. So the caterpillar stage is what's going to be, causing our issue potentially on a plant. So for example, a cabbage white that is taking out your kale, all those green caterpillars have to eat a lot of leaf tissue in order to turn into the little white butterflies that you see flying around. So yeah, so knowing, if you see those white adult butterflies, you're like, okay, maybe I should go scout my kale. The caterpillars can be pretty tricky to see since they turn like the same green as the kale. But managing those caterpillars is very different. There are treatments for those caterpillars. We really don't have treatments to be, killing adult butterflies. Like that's not the life stage that we're going to be targeting. Obviously, if it ends up being a disease, an antibiotic or an antifungal, you know, one of them will treat bacteria, one of them will treat fungus. They don't treat the other one. So having the correct diagnosis really helps ensure that you're putting a treatment out there that is targeting your actual problem. We don't want to be doing any like placebo spraying that's just maybe making us feel better about it, but not actually doing anything meaningful in the ecosystem. And then, use the resources that you have available. We've got a lot of resources here in South Dakota, and I'll show you some links and stuff here. But we do have our Ask Extension widget that's open sort of all year round. You can throw a question in there. You can put in up to 3 photos. So again, we like clear, in focus pictures. It doesn't have to be your entire camera roll. Just 3 of the best ones will be great. And you can throw your question in there, and then if it's an insect thing, I'll answer it. If it's something related to like, post-harvest handling, I'll send it Rhoda's way. We've got Dr. Christine Lang on there as well. There's quite a few of us. So if you've got a question and you want to just throw it in the widget, it's a great way to reach a whole bunch of us at once. We also have the plant diagnostic clinic, and that's where you can send physical samples, including samples that might need culturing for disease issues. So if you want to use the diagnostic clinic, definitely check out their website. They have a submission form and then mailing instructions, especially for fresh samples, as far as like what the best time is to mail them so that they don't get, kind of destroyed in transit or like spend, a weekend in a hot truck. But that's a great resource. There are some fees associated with some of their services, but they're not super huge, and it is really valuable, especially if you're dealing with trying to figure out a disease issue. We have our garden hotlines around the state during the growing season. Those are mostly for the home gardener side of things, but if you call one of them, we'll help get you an answer or get you to the right person. If you're near the Pierre Regional Center, you can always drop off insect samples and I'll take a look when I can. If you want to mail a sample to me or drop it off, I really encourage folks to have them in a hard-sided container. I don't want to end up with insect confetti. I've had that happen before. And it also really helps if the sample is frozen so that it is dead and not going to crawl out onto my desk. I did have one a couple years ago. Somebody dropped off some carpenter ants and they were still alive and they were in a container and they had just kind of like plastic film over the top, so like not like an actual like mason jar lid. And I took a look at them because I'd just gotten back from a program or whatever, and took a look and I was like, yep, those are carpenter ants. Like I will call the person back on Monday morning. And Monday morning I look in the container and it is empty because the carpenter ants had chewed their way out of the top. So luckily it wasn't anything like terrible. But please make sure that these samples are dead when you submit them. That makes my life a lot easier. So for pest monitoring and record keeping, there's a couple different ways that you can scout your fields. You can do passive scouting, so using like those traps I talked about, or maybe even sticky cards like the one pictured here. Sticky cards are really general, they'll anything that flies into them will stick. And so you're going to be, checking those maybe like once a week or so just to kind of see what's on there. Same deal with traps. Those can be a bit more specific. Like I mentioned with the pheromone traps, they're going to be sort of attracting a very specific insect. So you're not going to get a lot of bycatch in those. And then we've got active scouting. So using something like a sweep net or even just going through and like turning over X number of leaves to, scout for aphids or something. But anytime that you're out there scouting, keep notes. Grab a notebook, use your phone, keep track of what you're finding, when you're finding it, and how many of them you are finding. That can help you see trends in populations. So I spent a lot of time in soybean fields looking for soybean aphids. There's a lot of scouting out there, scouting recommendations for how to keep track of those, but monitoring their population over time, you can see, okay, is my population increasing? Is it decreasing? Is it staying the same? And then when looking at those populations, are they at a level that this crop can tolerate, or are we getting to a point where it's going to make economic sense for me to be treating? So management recommendations come into play when you've got a pest population that is reaching the economic threshold. The tricky thing with a lot of specialty crops is we don't always have a economic threshold or an economic injury level for every crop and every pest combination just because there are so many. So some of this might be you setting an economic threshold for your operation, based on previous experience, things that have happened in the past. But essentially, you're trying to figure out what's the number where the cost of the treatment is, equal to or less than um, the value of the crop that you're preserving. So those economic thresholds could be based on the amount of the pest that's out there, or something like percent defoliation. So it could be based on like the damage that you're seeing. And it's trying, we're trying to avoid getting to that economic injury level where your crop is hurt enough that you're losing too much value. So we're trying to keep everyone below the economic injury level. For home gardeners, like my economic threshold, like the limit does not exist. I'm doing a lot of gardening for the insects, not necessarily for me. But it's very different when you're in sort of a diversified vegetable production system and you're trying to fill CSA orders, have enough for the farmers market, that kind of stuff. So if you've never thought about your economic threshold, the off season is a great time to do some research on that, especially if you're growing a bunch of different crops. There are some out there, especially for like our cucurbits and things, but some of our more specific crop combinations, and especially for South Dakota, we don't necessarily have a ton of them. But now's the time to maybe think about and run some of those numbers so that you can be ready for the 2025 season. So for management, it's not always like spraying. A lot of people think that, the only version of pest control is getting out something with, an EPA label on it and a nozzle. But there are management strategies that don't include any of those things. Things like planting resistant varieties. So like if you've got a powdery mildew problem, choosing a variety of, cucumber that is resistant to that. Perhaps being able to change your planting time so that you're missing the window where an insect is active, or maybe the window where, a disease is showing up a whole bunch. And then looking into preventative treatments versus curative. So things that you can maybe do to support the plant health, I know a lot of times in fruit production, especially if you follow the tree pest alert that Dr. John Ball publishes, there's a lot of preventative treatments in fruit production that are very important and you've got to be on top of, because once, say, you get the disease issue, there aren't a whole lot of effective curatives necessarily. So yeah, if you're a fruit producer, tree tree pest alert should be some of your required reading. But with IPM, we're really utilizing multiple management strategies. So we're planting the resistant varieties, we're changing our planting times, all of the things that we can do to maybe, move ourselves away from some of our persistent pest issues. Um, some of the management strategies, kind of depending on your practices with tillage or no till, if you're not going to be tilling, then you're going to have to do maybe some different things for weed control. Um, but yeah, there's lots of stuff out there. Each one of those bullet points could be its own presentation on all the different control measures out there. Biological control is one of my favorites for insect management because it involves using more insects. So pictured here, we have one of our native lady beetle species, and lady beetles eat a whole bunch of aphids. So you're never going to get to sort of zero aphids in an environment, but things like ladybugs and lacewings do a great job of helping to keep them underneath, that economic threshold. And we do have some printed resources. So if you do, find me in person here at the Peer Regional Center, or at Chamberlain this week, we've got a flip guide to natural enemies. And if you would like one, you can also shoot me an email and we'll drop one in the mail to you as well. So we've got some physical resources for some of these things too that you can check out. And then a note on chemical control for folks that are in organic production. Organic pesticides are still pesticides, so you do still need to read and follow those label directions. Use the safety equipment, use the personal protective equipment. Just because it's labeled organic does not mean that it is without risk to you or the environment. And you also do still need to be licensed with the state. So. Um, one thing too to point out to folks is that climate and weather monitoring is really impactful in an IPM program. We have the climate.sdstate.edu, our Mesonet website. So we're getting more weather stations sort of every month across South Dakota. The program has really, had a bunch of federal funding over the past couple of years to increase access so that folks in more rural locations of South Dakota have a reliable weather station nearby. So you can use these stations for record keeping. The website has a tool for degree days. So degree days, if you're not familiar with them, it's how we measure sort of like heat units for development. So especially for insect life cycles, they're very temperature dependent. So the more degree days you accumulate, that can tell us when certain things are going to be emerging or active. And so those tools are available on the Mesonet website. And then you can also, get the sort of 10-day forecast as well. And it is a website, it's not an app. We don't have the money to be managing an app for all the different platforms, but definitely check out the Mesonet if you haven't already. And then sort of the last step of the circle before you start all over again is assessing the effect of your IPM program. Did your management strategy work? So if you do go out and say put out a spray for your striped cucumber beetles, scout again to see if anything died. We do have sort of increasing issues with insect resistance or insect resistance to different insecticides. So making sure that things actually died or disappeared or did what you wanted them to do is really important. Because that way, you can collect samples and, we can do some investigating if the treatment didn't work. But yeah, definitely go out and re-scout. So yeah, during the season, for solving your pest problems, decide how much damage you can tolerate. Pictured here is a Japanese beetle that just really, really took out some green beans. Um, Obviously, this has gone way too far for a lot of people, but decide how much damage you can tolerate might be different based on whatever the crop is. Make sure you're identifying the problem, starting with the least toxic control and then moving up if needed. So maybe starting with row covers, and then continuing on if you need to. Always read and follow the product label for anything, including those disinfectants that Rhoda was talking about. Those also have a label. And making sure that you're wearing proper protective clothing and following safety protocols. So with that, I'll see if there are any questions. But yeah, again, this was from I think I was in Iowa at a SARE meeting, and the milkweed outside of the research station had a whole bunch of aphids on it. So this is Aphis nerrii, the milkweed aphid. And then it also had Japanese beetles. So that milkweed was really just having a time of it. And I was like, oh, look at all those pests all in one place. And here is my contact information. Again, I'm located here in Pierre at the regional center. You can always shoot me an email. Just make sure you get those two N's on my last name. Otherwise, I won't get it. And then my phone number. And with that, I'll go ahead and stop sharing and see what we've got. All right. I think so far we've gotten out of here without any questions. Shocking. I was gonna say that's okay. I know garden hour people hit us up there. So we're not completely off the hook.
Amanda, I have a
Yes,
question for you.
go for it.
You talked about resistance to insect pests, plant resistance. Do you have any examples of that?
Ooh, I'm trying to think if we have any that are actually, so there are some tomato varieties. I'd have to probably do some research to see which specific ones, but like to some of the tomato like herbivorous pests, they'll have more like fuzzy leaves because the caterpillar, like the tomato hornworm, doesn't like all those trichomes. So some of the fuzzier tomato varieties can be not as attractive to some of the caterpillars. That's one off the top of my head. Usually resistance though is like mostly diseases.
Right.
Um, yeah, plant wise, it's like for insects, a lot of times it's just like trying to erect a physical barrier because which is tricky in South Dakota because it is so windy.
Right.
We
There's
were
so
much
many pesticides, particularly bacteria, that are being formulated for pest control now.
mhm.
Do you have a feeling for how those are working in South Dakota?
Yeah, so a lot of those are going to be the BT, the Bacillus thuringiensis, some of the different varieties. A lot of people think BT is maybe only for mosquitoes, like the mosquito dunks is sort of the most common one. But we do have BT that works for other sort of the larval stage of other insects. We've got BT that is specific for flies. We've got a BT that is specific for some caterpillars. So there are some BTs for caterpillars, and those are great because they are very targeted. If a caterpillar eats it, it's only messing with the caterpillar's gut proteins. It's not necessarily messing with another insect. So those can be some of our some of our more targeted insecticides. And then I think we've got some for grubs. Like if you've got grubs in lawns, there's a BT for those as well.
I've always wanted to try the nematodes
For the grubs.
for grubs. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and the nematodes, like I think the reason they don't really work so great in South Dakota is that it is so dry.
Mm.
So like in just a lawn or like in a garden situation, unless you've got really just consistent irrigation and maybe a less clayey soil, the nematodes just like can't hack it.
Maybe a mulch.
Yeah, it's like, and I don't even, and maybe like, and not necessarily that you'd have a ton of issues in a raised bed, like you might eventually, but if you've got some sort of better soil conditions, nematodes might do better in there. But then also the survivorship from year to year because you've got sort of a more of exposed area. But yeah, like the nematodes are so cool and they definitely work in other parts of the country, especially for like Japanese beetle grubs. But it can be tough out there, tough out there in South Dakota for a nematode, for a beneficial nematode. And then we also have some of the different biological controls that if you're in sort of a controlled system growing space. So, doing a high tunnel or a greenhouse, you can release predatory mites that can help with, problem mites like two-spotted spider mites, help with things like white flies. We've got some little parasitoid wasps that you can utilize as well against aphids. So if you're in sort of a controlled system where you're managing sort of all of the inputs, there are some insects that can help you out that way, as well as things like keeping a little like bumblebee colony in your high tunnel or in your greenhouse to help with buzz pollination. So lots of different ways that insects can help you out. But yeah, and I think there was a survey that popped up, so thank you to everyone who completed that. And well, awesome. We've got
You do
two
have
more.
one question there.
Oh, we've got a question. All right. Source of where to get beneficials. So yes and no. For things like, getting a hive, getting, bumblebee hives or whatever, you can purchase those. Um, for some of the beneficial insects like the lady beetles and like lacewings and things like that, I really encourage folks to have the habitat around for those because they're out there in the environment. They're just maybe not sticking around. I've been part of like ladybug releases, and let me tell you, they just leave. Like unless you have like so don't just release them into the outdoors because they will just disperse into the neighborhood. It's a little different if you've got, again, a controlled system where like they're going to be stuck inside with you and each other. But you also have to think about, density. Ladybugs are predators. Like you don't need 5,000 of them in in a space necessarily. So yeah, so outdoors, like they'll just sort of ordering them doesn't make a ton of sense because they're just going to disperse into the environment. But growing, having some of those, like sort of strips of, perennials or, that have some forbs, some grasses, some other little flowering plants. So like your parasitoids can pick up some nectar. Having that habitat around gives them a refuge and a place to hang out, and then you can increase your numbers. I've got a black walnut tree in my front yard that always gets aphids, so that's my like natural enemy nursery. I get ladybugs because of that tree. Same deal with the lacewings. Like I'll just have lacewing larvae like in my lawn, like biting my toes, because I've got aphids in a tree, so they've got something to eat. Because that's the thing, like if you don't have any of their food, like if you don't have any aphids, you don't have any of those soft-bodied insects, they're not going to hang out. Like they do need something to eat. So that's why I tell people that you're never going to get to like zero aphids. Um, because yeah, if you do, you're not going to see any of those ladybugs, which I mean could be a good thing, but yeah, you can definitely get like the different like mites and stuff for greenhouse production. And then you also want to make sure that once you release stuff that you're scouting, because you want to see if they're working and if they're also persisting and living in the environment. So yeah. But I think we're at the top of the hour. So thank you so much, everybody who attended. I'll be back tomorrow with Robin Butterbaugh. I think Robin's tomorrow. Yeah, we've got quite a few presentations. And then yes, Robin's tomorrow. Dr. Christine Lang is on Thursday. So we will see folks again later this week. Thanks for attending, and enjoy the rest of your day.